Okay, folks, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Uh, appreciate everybody coming this afternoon here to the Writing About Your Ancestry with Danielle Trussoni. My name is Barry McKnight. I'm the programming coordinator for the La Crosse Public Library. The La Crosse Public Library is one of the hosts or co-host for this program, along with the Mississippi Valley Writers Guild. And we're also, both organizations are part of a larger collaborative called Great River Writes, which my colleague Jess Witkins is going to talk about here in just a second. So just a couple housekeeping things. So if everybody could keep their microphones muted as much as possible during the program, that way we won't have that be a disruption. If you have questions, please put them into the chat, and over the course of the program, perhaps closer to the end, we'll go through some of those, and Jess Witkins will field those to Danielle. So I'm going to turn it over to Jess, and take it away, Jess.
Hello. Well, first, I just want to say thank you and welcome again on behalf of the Mississippi Valley Writers Guild. If you are unfamiliar with us, we are a nonprofit writing community based in the La Crosse area. We have 4 critique groups, all of which are meeting virtually right now. So if you are looking for a critique group or just looking for other writers to connect with, please reach out to us. I will put our website in the chat box so you can check us out. As Barry mentioned, we are a sponsor along with La Crosse Public Library for this event, and part of Great River Writes, which is a collaboration of many different writing and arts organizations, writers groups, and UWL is a partner as well, and different arts organizations and libraries across Western Wisconsin and Eastern Minnesota. So it's been a really fun collaboration. We have one more workshop after this next Saturday, the 21st, we will be welcoming, I've had too much coffee today, friends. We will be welcoming Chris Fishbach from Coffee House Press to talk about the ins and outs of publishing. So I hope you join us for that as well. It is through the collaboration of all of the organizations involved that we are able to offer these as free series in the fall for National Novel Writing Month. So we're excited to do that. Without further ado, today we get to welcome former La Crosse resident and internationally best-selling author, columnist, and creator Danielle Trussoni. She is a regular contributor to the New York Times Book Review, where she writes the Dark Matters column. She's also a member of the National Book Critics Circle and was the chair of the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction jury this year. You may know her work from the paranormal thriller Angelology series or her family-driven memoirs. Her new book, The Ancestor, came out in April 2020, and I'm sure many of you have questions about what's a book launch like during a global pandemic? Danielle can answer that. For more information about Danielle and her books, you can check out her website, danielletrussoni.com. Please welcome Danielle Trussoni. Applause.
Thank you, Jess. What an introduction. And before I start, I want to say thank you to the La Crosse Public Library and thank you to the Mississippi Valley Writers Guild for inviting me. I was so looking forward to being in La Crosse in person because this was all going to happen in person before the world tipped on its axis and everything changed. So I'm a little sad that I'm not there. I was saying to Jess before this began that I used to work at the library when right after high school, actually. And so I have very fond memories of the library and would have loved to have been there. But that said, I'm really pleased to be able to be here with you now for this. Doing a workshop on Zoom is a little bit disconnecting, I think. So, I'm going to try to be as interactive as possible. I know you can't ask questions now, but if you do have a question, make sure and stick it in the chat. Write something in the chat and I'll be sure to answer it at the end. Essentially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of writing both memoir and novels that use themes of family in some way and ancestry, but I'm also going to do an interactive workshop with you where I'm going to talk about your writing and ways that you can write about family as well. So for those of you who have read my works, you probably know that I have family elements in all of my books. And so I'm going to grab them now. I have a stack here of my books. And I'm going to just tell you like what aspects of family are in each of these books so that it's not so abstract. So I'm going to start with this one. This is my first book, which is a memoir about my relationship with my father, who was in the Vietnam War. I mean, that's just the basics, right? It's also an excavation of my family history. I grew up in La Crosse. My father was born and grew up in Genoa, Wisconsin. And my childhood was sort of surrounded by stories of his childhood and his time in Vietnam. So in this book, I use my father's stories to sort of create a narrative about family, but also about looking into how war shapes families and how the after effects of the Vietnam War in particular affected my family and me. So that book is very clearly about ancestry, family, genealogies, and that sort of thing. So then my next book after that was my first novel, Angelology. And while, you know, it seems a little bit odd to say that a supernatural thriller could in any way be about my family, I will say that it's very much a study of family histories as well. I mean, it's a different kind of family histories. And even the Spanish edition of that novel, they had a subtitle that was basically said the Book of Generations, right? Because there's so many generational connections in that novel. The main character is named Evangeline, and we're sort of following her in the beginning, but then it as time moves forward, or as the story moves forward, it unravels that she's carrying this legacy that's been going back through her family for hundreds of years. So that's that. And then my next memoir, The Fortress, came out in 2016, and that is a story about my relationship with my ex-husband and my divorce, my own family unraveling in some ways, and trying to understand how that connects to myself in a larger way, and also about the idea of what relationships are. And then the newest book, The Ancestor, which just came out in April, it's fiction. And it's about a woman who discovers that she takes a DNA test and discovers that her family is absolutely 100% different than what she thought it was. She's told that she is the last descendant of this sort of rich, noble family in the Italian Alps. And she goes there, and then things go very wrong. So it's kind of, it's a little bit, there's a little bit of, a horror novel sort of wrapped up in a family story in that book. So all of these books, as you see, like in some way, do talk about family. And when I was writing them, I had no idea that that was a theme for me. Actually, other people have come to me and said, "Oh, do you realize that all of your books sort of center around home or center around family?" So I only began to sort of realize that after the books were published. So Jess, is it okay for me to read some excerpts of a few books just to give people the flavor? Okay, like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that's okay?
This is your show.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm gonna read, if I can find it. There's a section from Falling Through the Earth that is so it's interesting. The Ancestor, as I mentioned, is about a woman who discovers that she has family in the Italian Alps. Well, my own personal genealogy on my father's side is from the Alps. My great-grandparents were born in a tiny little village called Campodelcino, and came over to settle in Genoa, Wisconsin, with a lot of other Italian-American immigrants. And so when I was growing up, my dad's side of the family was very much steeped in that culture and stories that my great-grandfather told. One of them, some of them in particular, ended up in Falling Through the Earth. And so I am going to read just a little section, hopefully I can find it, from my memoir about that. So, okay, it's just a little piece. So the Trussonis came from Genoa, population 250, a town that was all stretch and no slump. Rising from a gap in the bluffs, it ventured vertically into the steeps rather than horizontally along the Mississippi River. The town center consisted of little more than a dairy cooperative, a small business district, a grocery, a cafe, a few bars, and a Catholic church. A caramel-colored dirt road funneled from the church to a two-lane highway where cars rolled by, their metallic reflections foiling the Mississippi surface. East of town, the shifting roller coaster hills began. This was where my father was born, in a farmhouse surrounded by fields of yellow and umber and brown, corn and wheat and potatoes. An overblown barn rose over the farmhouse, red as a rooster's jowl. My family didn't live there any longer, but I like to imagine how it had been 50 years ago, inhabited. The farmhouse had been built by my great-grandfather, Giovanni Battista Trussoni, to resemble the stout mountain houses of northern Italy. Family lore has it that in order to earn his passage to America, he hiked the steep, snowy paths of the Italian Alps into Switzerland every Friday to sell goat cheese at the Saturday market. He climbed and sold and saved. After marrying a girl from his village named Martina, he set his sights on 2 transatlantic fares. When he'd saved enough, he purchased tickets and a piece of land near his cousin's homestead in Wisconsin. My great-grandparents arrived in winter. Half of Campodelcino, the alpine homeland of Genoa's founders, was already there. The snow was deep, the wind icy, but despite the freeze, my great-grandfather set to work on the farmhouse immediately. So I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to give you a little taste of how the stories from my great-grandfather entered into that memoir. There's not a whole lot about my extended family in this memoir. It's mostly about me and my dad, but you know, there's pieces, paragraphs here and there about all of them. And I found that doing that kind of research, so if you hear a baby crying, it's my 2-year-old. She's waking up from her nap right now. I find that you know, doing the research about my extended family was half of the fun, right? I really enjoy doing research about family, and I went to Campodelcino after I wrote the book. You know, many years after I wrote the book, I went to Campodelcino, and I was able to see some of the traits that people from Genoa had carried over, which was fascinating. The way that our stories and our cultures, you know, from one place move to another and change. I even found there was an Alimentari Trussoni still, like, in this little town, and Alimentari is like a grocery store, right? So it was fascinating to me to find that that connection. So then, you know, fast forward a number of years, like 10, 15 years, and I came across, I had this idea that I wanted to write a novel about a woman whose life absolutely changes when she takes a DNA test, right? Or, you know, somehow I still think it's fascinating that right now, at this point in time, we can take a DNA test and we can find out so much about our ancestry and so much genetically about where we came from. Whereas, 50 years ago, that was pretty much impossible. So that idea seemed very modern to me, but also I was interested in how it played out in the past. So this character in the Ancestor, she takes this test and she finds out that she has this family, and she actually goes to a small village in the Alps where she essentially gets trapped in this place, and she's trying to understand. It's, I'll just give you a little bit of backstory. It's very snowy. She's dropped in by helicopter. The roads are closed down. It's so far in the Alps that she can't hike out. But while she's there, she's trying to understand, about her family and how the past may explain some strange things that have happened to her in her life. And so one part that I wanted to read a little bit from, I don't know how much, is, so she goes, when she's there, there's a big library, and there's an archive in this library that sort of has, it's a repository of family history. And this family is no ordinary family, right? It's 1,000 years of history. The first member of this family is from like 1050 or something, right? It's a very old family. So there's lots of information. And so there's an archivist named Basil. And, I'm just going to say, when I worked at the La Crosse Public Library, I worked as an assistant in the archive. And interestingly enough, in all of my novels, there's an archive. So I must have been pretty influenced by that experience. But so there's an archivist named Basil, who is in charge of all the family documents. And he, let me find the best part. I don't want to read for too long because we've got a lot of other things to talk about. Let's see. Okay. So, they're in the library, and on the wall, and I'm going to show this to you later, because this is real. This was really in a real castle, in an actual library in that castle. There are murals painted all around the ceiling of the family tree, right? Which I found fascinating. So I included it in my book. And so Basil is saying that he, in my work these past years, I've unearthed information that has been buried for generations. I found diaries stashed in trunks in the West Tower, lists of guests visiting the castle during the 17th century, Alberta and Prince Amadeo's last wills and testaments, renovation plans after the fire in the 1500s, and of course, the genealogical records. I am the only person who knows the entire Montebianco family tree. He gestured to the murals and the incredible branching and flowering of my family. All 29 generations, and if one includes you. He stood, grabbed a cane with an ivory handle and pointed it at the ceiling. We will need to get a muralist up here in the spring, he said. He tapped a white space on the ceiling. Your name will go right here. I looked up at the Montebianco family tree, at the names of my relatives painted in a florid cursive and adorned with various coats of arms of noble houses that had, over the years, merged into the Montebianco clan. Montebianco is the family name, is her family's name. The branching off of names and dates and family connections started from two names at the top, Frederick and Isabel, and ended at the bottom with my grandfather Giovanni and his brother Guillaume. With the other branches of the family included, the mural funneled up over this entire ceiling. We'll need to add my parents too, I said, Giuliano and Barb. Giuliano must have been named after this Giuliano, Basil said, pointing to a name. Giuliano Prince de Condé, a cadet branch of the House of Bourbon, a dashing rake who embarrassed the family with his voracious sexual appetite. He happened to have been married to another Alberta. There were many Albertas, all named, like you were, after the first Alberta Montebianco, born to Isabel and Frederick in the 13th century. I glanced at the union of Alberta and Giuliano, another meeting of the Montebianco coat of arms with that of an illustrious family. We can have your parents painted here, and you right below, Basil said. Did she have a family coat of arms, your mother? I shook my head. Regular people don't have coats of arms, I said, or such elaborate family trees. It isn't only about class, Basil said, it's about inheritance and tribal identity. The family tree, as a recording device, is thought to derive from biblical sources. It acted as a form of cultural identification, of course, but also was a badge of inclusion. If you recall, Jesus could trace his ancestry to the house of David, and this gave him a legitimacy that he would not have had otherwise. The practice of keeping track of genealogy was more vital to noble families. They were careful to delineate bloodlines and avoid mixing with undesirable families. The importance of genealogical records at that time cannot be overestimated. Now, as you very well know, everyone can create a family tree on the internet. What used to be art is now a pastime. Okay, so I'll stop there because that leads me to something that I became fascinated with when I was researching this, is going online and, whether it's part of Ancestry.com or 23andMe, and looking up family records. So I'm going to share my screen with you because there's a kind of an interesting story that I think you might find amusing. Let me just figure out how to do it. You get to see my, okay. So, let's see. When I went to, when I started researching this, I took a 23andMe test myself. And as you heard in my first memoir, I thought I was descended from this big Italian family. I am descended from this big Italian family. The 23andMe test came back saying I was 1.7% Italian. Okay. And I was like, hold on a second here. 1.7% Italian, I should be like at least 30%, right? There should be a good portion of my ancestry that's Italian. So I asked my sister, who's a couple of years younger than me, you need to take this test too to make sure that I'm like, who knows what's going on here, right? And so she took it, and she too was 1.7% Italian. And so that set me off. Actually, that was the origin for this story in some ways, because it was a mystery, right? And the more research I did, I realized that northern Italy, that part of northern Italy where my great-grandparents came from, was this huge mixture of genetic material, really, between Austrians and French people and Germans. And so most of my ancestry was actually more Northern Italian or Northern European, those countries I just mentioned, rather than Italian. Okay. But still, the shock was enough to make me think this would be an amazing novel, right? Someone has this surprise. But so let's see, where should I begin? The first thing I started doing when I had the idea and I wanted to think about this character's surprise ancestry is I realized that I needed to kind of create a real family for her. So something I did is I built out a family tree for the Montebianco family. And so this coat of arms, so the Montebianco family is a totally made up family. None of it's true. But Alberta, who is our main character right here, I had her, she was born in 1988. And this is, in the passage, the excerpt I just read to you, she mentions her parents, right? Barbara and Giuliano. And then this is her father's parents, and then so on and so forth, all the way back. We skip some generations here to Isabel and Frederick, who I also mentioned in that passage, who were the sort of founding couple. So I did that, I created that family tree because when writing, this gets us back to writing, when you're writing about a family, the most important thing, I think, for me anyway, when I'm reading about a family, and I think for most readers, is to understand the kind of tribalism of that family and understand what makes that family itself rather than any other family. And I needed to know who these characters were in order to do that. So I also made this, I had a designer make this family crest, which was really a lot of fun. And also something that I did that maybe just shows my obsession with doing family research when I write or doing research is I worked with a genetic counselor to make a genetic family tree that would explain certain genetic aberrations that are in the family. And if you haven't read the book, I'm sorry, I don't want to give away too much, but there is a kind of bizarre family inheritance, a genealogical one and one that's genetic. And so, so this is a genetic chart, right? That an actual genetic counselor made for me, and we went through it. And so the family is all normal, through here, and then in this couple, there's an intermingling between Leopold and an unknown source, right? And from that point on, that genetic material gets passed down until Alberta has it. So I know this is something that never came into the novel. I don't have a chart like this in the novel. I don't have a geneticist taking samples of blood and doing this. But for me as a writer, it was really important to have that mapped out. And you as writers, even if you don't write, you as readers, I think it's the verisimilitude and the realistic nature of a piece of fiction just makes it more enjoyable. It makes it more believable, and it helps you to not stop and say, what is that, right? Like if someone makes an error in a family dynamic, for example, it's something that you as readers might stop. Might make you stop. So another thing that, another aspect of my research, and this was really, I have to say, just, the really toughest part, is that I actually went to the Alps in Italy, and I went and I visited the place that I wrote about. So my great-grandfather came from Campodelcino, which is in a different part of the Alps. Where I wanted to set this novel was a more remote, kind of more scary part of the Alps. It's right below Mont Blanc on the Italian side in the Aosta Valley, and it's quite remote. So I went, here's me. I went there, and this is Mont Blanc right here. And you can see the mountains in the background. And I went walking in these mountains with a notebook, collecting sort of details of the trees and the flowers and the kinds of rock I was seeing. I went to restaurants and ate the local food, which really difficult, and tried the local wine and did all of the sorts of things that my characters do, right? So that I could better write about it. I'm the kind of writer that some part of me needs to experience the location and the environment for me to be able to write about it effectively. And I think that's because the kind of writing I do and the kind of writing I enjoy reading is atmospheric. I like when people set up a sort of big atmospheric world that I can inhabit. So to that end, I stayed in a castle. Here's a picture of the castle I stayed in. And it was just an Airbnb. Interestingly enough, they do Airbnb at this castle. And I was able to walk around, take photos, write, sort of basically map out details that I would use for the book. This is another picture. This is a tower that was at that castle I stayed at. And that tower ended up being in my novel. This little window, when my main character, Alberta, arrives at the castle, we see someone in this window in the novel. And it really came from that experiential research. What else can I show you? So I was there, and one small detail that was fascinating to me about this part of the world is that these are Ebics, right? These are a kind of mountain goat. And in the 19th century, apparently, these were everywhere in the Alps. But it was there was a sort of legend that the more of them you killed, the more manly you were and the more virility you would have. So a lot of the men went out and killed thousands of Ebics. And so there are trophy rooms in castles that have literally, I think this one room had 3,000 sets of horns, right? All everywhere like this. You can see these are skulls right here. And so that's a detail, another very small local detail that I would never have been able to write about if I hadn't been there and I hadn't walked through a room and seen these. And that ends up in the book too. I also, when I was there, visited wine cellars. The Aosta Valley has really particular kinds of wine. If you can imagine, like all the way up in the Alps like that, it has a really particular flavor. And I was fascinated when I was there. Oh, this, I want to show you this. This is the door to that castle. I showed you a picture where we were out here before. These coats of arms are all of families that married into or were part of the family that owned this castle. And so that detail in my book came from there as well. These are the sorts of small things that when you're writing fiction, it's just gold, right? When you go and you discover something like that, because it's beautiful to write about, and it's also interesting for readers to imagine, and it's also historically accurate. So that was really fun to find. This is, I found this portrait. I became a little bit obsessive about like the old portraits that I was seeing when I was doing this research, because I used a lot of them in the novel. Obviously my family is not nobility, and my great-grandparents were goat herders and making cheese, and then they came to Wisconsin and were farmers. So that's clearly not my background, but in this novel, that background is part of it. So I needed to make sure that I had the details right. So I did take a lot of photos of these sort of noble portraits. Here's another guy looking very perturbed. I don't know, that expression is pretty interesting. Okay, so anything else? So I also became a little bit obsessed with family trees and ancestry, right? Here, this was painted on the wall in the castle that I stayed at. And this is the family tree, I think, of Jesus. I think it's all the way from Christ all the way back. And, just with certain names. And yeah, you can see that this is the Crusaders, I think, this little part here, and then there's some angels. And anyway, the idea of what a family tree meant, that was their way of telling stories, right? They didn't have novels the way that we do. Clearly, they weren't on Ancestry.com making trees so that everyone could connect. So this was their way of recording and preserving their relationships, which I find, it's so very different than how our life is now, and so very different than how we think of family now. I think that's it. I'll just leave you with this, since it is a Wisconsin group, this amazing piece of cheese. This is a sheep cheese, right? And it was delicious, I have to tell you. And I had it for breakfast. So they would serve you on this beautiful platter a piece of cheese with breakfast. And I thought, this is amazing. I think that this is home for me. Okay, so something else that I don't want to spend too much time on this, because I have a writing exercise, and I want to sort of talk to you about your writing, but let me just make sure that I have everything that I wanted to show you. Yeah, I think that that's good. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and you can come back to me. So now I'm on to another book, right? And again, I find, although the theme and the main story is very far from my personal life, I save my personal stories for my memoirs, I think, and then things that are sort of more imaginative I put in novels. I find myself gravitating toward using a family story in the novel I'm writing, and lucky me, on my mom's side of the family, which I have never really, my mom probably wouldn't like this if she knew. I mean, she'll be fine with it, but my mom is a very private person and she probably doesn't want me writing about anything in her family. But I found this book, which is a history of, on my mother's side her grandfather's grandfather. And he was a kind of rogue. The name of this book is A Rogue's Life. And he did a bunch of crazy things during the Civil War. And so that's a part of my history that I had no idea about. So I just found this book and I've been reading it. And I've also found, so this is the character in this book who I don't even know, that would make him my what, great grandfather? I don't even know, a couple of greats there, right? But his son or his grandson is my great grandfather. And so I found this picture of him. I don't know if you can see that. So this is him. He used to play the accordion. He was a vaudeville actor. And this is my great grandmother, right? And they used to travel around in this car. This car, is it reflected? In the 1920s, performing. So, he played the accordion and I think she played the saxophone. Craziness, right? So I'm using those interesting family stories, not exactly the 1920 section, but the older section from the Civil War. I'm incorporating and folding some of those stories into a novel I'm writing now. So basically that brings me to this section about how can you do that, right? This is a writing workshop. If we were all sitting around a table together right now, I would make sure you all had your notebooks out and a pen, and we would start talking about how you can use family stories to inspire you, bolster a story you've already written that you want it to have some more depth or different characters, how you can essentially map out a family tree of your own and use that to inspire you. So I guess what I'd like to do now is, so I'm going to show you something. If you have paper and pen at home, and it's handy, grab it, because I'm going to share my screen again and just show you this thing that I have used. But obviously you don't have to use that. It's on Ancestry.com. And it's, where is it? There we go. It's an ancestral chart, right? And if you want, you can go to Ancestry.com and it's free, and you just pull it out. And you can list, people in your life and details about them, where they were born, when they were born, where they were born, were they married, what did they die of, and characteristics and that sort of thing. I used this is sort of a version of what I used when I made that imaginary family tree for my character in the Ancestor. And what I'd like to do today is, if you would like to sketch out, just from memory, obviously, so maybe it's the family that's closest to you, sketch out a little family tree and see if one of those characters, because we don't normally think of our family as characters, right? But try to distance yourself. If one of those family members or one of those characters have an interesting story that you might be able to tell. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to do that, if you're in the mood. Okay, well, so if we were in person, I probably would give you a lot more time, but since I'm not there, I can't see I can't see your progress. I'm just going to guess that you have a couple of things jotted down. And I myself, actually, this is not something I'm writing now, but I myself decided, just now, be a very cool story. Oh, am I still sharing my screen? Let me stop sharing my screen. It'd be a very cool story, maybe for me, because this guy, my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, their adventure of driving their car around during the 1920s and the sorts of things that happened. I also happen to know that he eventually abandoned her. She had 2 children and then he just took off. So, that is a very dramatic story, right? And that would be the sort of thing that, in my mind, what I would be mapping out is, 1, is that a novel? 2, is that a memoir, right? So if you have these characters, you might want to start exploring, how much do I feel comfortable telling in reality, right? Like, how much would I be comfortable revealing about my family? Because that's always a question. And I'm sure we can talk about this when I'm taking questions. And number 2, how comfortable do I feel making stuff up if it's a novel, right? Some people feel very connected to the true, sort of portraits of family members, and it's hard to make stuff up about them. So those are questions that I have. I mean, I would just, can we ask a couple of people who have maybe made a family chart if they want to just throw out a few character ideas or story ideas that they have from their family tree?
Yeah, do you want them to unmute themselves or throw that in the chat? Do you have a preference?
Maybe, yeah, if there's someone, I don't know, if someone wants to raise their hand, you can virtually raise your hand if you have one. Can you see everybody? Because I can't see everybody. So Susan raised her hand. Susan, do you want to unmute yourself? So if Susan wants to unmute herself, and 2 more participants raise their hand too. So that's good. We can just, share. I'm just not sure how to, do we have to unmute them, or can they unmute themselves?
She should be able to unmute herself.
Okay, Susan, so you can unmute yourself if you want to share your family story, your tree and your family story, the member that you're thinking about. But I can't hear you, so maybe you're not unmuted.
If people need a little guide, if you wave your mouse over the bottom of your video screen, you should have a little toolbar, and there's a microphone button that'll have mute or unmute. If there's a red slash, you're muted. So click that, Susan, and hopefully we'll get you.
I have a character.
I'm unmuted and have a character.
Okay, so yeah, Susan didn't actually want to go, so that's fine. So Brian, do you want to go first, and then the other person who said that she has a character, you can go after?
Just quickly, the 2 sides of the family in northern Minnesota. I have double cousins. My mother's brother married my father's sister, and there was I didn't understand how that happened. And so what I've done is researched, and I finally got some family memoirs that have the 2 families farming in the same area, and the children getting to know each other and eventually intermarriage, and then everybody leaves northern Minnesota. So it's this coming together, marriage, double cousin, and then leaving again,
So that's fascinating that you were able to get family memoirs. How lucky.
Well, the cousins meet, and one of my uncles, one of the 15 children that came out of the earlier generation, simply had his sisters write their memoirs, and then one of the brothers wrote his autobiography, and it was just there. They were just describing how my parents and my double cousin's parents met and, you know, danced together and all this, went to school together. It's just amazing. But there was no understanding of how this happened, how these two families came together, where they came from.
Well, that will be an interesting story for you to explore. I mean, this is what's so great about looking at your family as material. I know it's sometimes hard to like
Yeah.
that calculating, but you know, looking at your family as material, it's great for a writer, right? Because you have all of this stuff and these memoirs. So that's going to be exciting for you.
My one question to you that's burning me up right now is, when I write this material, how do I include some of that extensive primary material, letters and all unpublished? These are just things handed down through the family.
That's a great question. And you know, if it's possible that you can just use them as they are, right? If
Yeah,
it's not copyrighted material, I mean, you can then make an acknowledgement in the back of the book saying these are actual letters. But you know, other stuff you're going to want it to feel like a narrative, right? So you'll adapt it into the story that you create. But yeah, having that material is very helpful. And some, you know, I think in Falling Through the Earth, I did use some things verbatim, right? Like I had tape recordings between me and my father that I did interviews with him about Vietnam, and I used some of those just verbatim, exactly as they were on the tape. So great. So I think Janet had, she said in the chat that her great grandmother packed up her 12 kids and took off from Stillwater, Minnesota to Oregon and California to escape an abusive husband.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's an amazing story.
Yeah, she kind of dropped off the face of the earth as far as the family was concerned for maybe close to 20 years. And then later on, two of her children, Anna and Louis, who was my grandfather, came back to St. Paul, where they had relatives living. And my grandfather's name was Louis Jacoby, and his sister Anna married a widower named August Wolf. And August Wolf had a daughter named Anna, and she ended up marrying her stepmother's brother, which made her Anna Jacoby. So Anna Jacoby became Anna Wolf, and Anna Wolf became Anna Jacoby. And so my grandmother's stepmother was also her mother-in-law.
Yeah, so your challenge as a writer, I think, Janet, would be to how to put all of that really interesting material into a story that people felt connected to the characters. And I mean, would you want to, I guess it's a question for you to think about, like if you'd want to write about that as it really happened, or if you would want to make sort of fictional version of that. But it sounds like you have really great material to start with.
I thought it could be confusing to somebody coming from a couple of generations beyond, trying to figure out the changes in names.
Well, that would be your task. I think that would be the hard part, the thing, the challenge that you have as a writer, right? Yeah. And then, the other part would be the question of whether you even need to mention that, right? Like if it were a novel, for example, suddenly you have all of the license in the world to change things, right? If you're writing a novel, you don't have to mention that at all.
No.
So that would be fun. Does anyone else have a family story they want to share? If you do, you can write it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll see it. So
Susan shared in the chat that her great-great-grandmother was an immigrant who outlived 3 husbands. She was a midwife and started and ran the first hotel in her hometown.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, that's a great family story. So just in the 3 examples that we've had here, there's material for almost epic family stories, right? And it's just a question of having the desire and the motivation to turn those family stories into either a novel or a memoir. And you know, that's, I guess, that's the point where it becomes, where you become different than just someone on Ancestry.com or someone who's doing a lot of genealogical work, and you become a writer, right? Because to make that transition from just someone who's doing that research for family reasons, or you know, because it's interesting, which is something that'll, you know, I do that myself. You know, there are elements of my family I've researched that I have not used in fiction or a memoir, and using that material because you want to write about it. And so that's a totally different, you know, situation. I wonder, so there's a lot of questions, Jess. I wonder if maybe we should start answering those questions in the chat, because I don't know if we'll have enough time if we don't start. Do you want to go through and ask them to me, and then I can answer? Would that work?
Yeah, you bet. So one of these, I'm going to combine two questions that are similar, and it's very topical to what you were just discussing. So one person asked, is your father alive, and did he read your memoir of him? What did he think of it? So I'm wondering if you can share, how do you tread that line of writing about people who are real, and are there pros and cons? Someone else asked, is it a healing element at all when writing about family?
So, you know, very, very interesting and relevant questions about memoir writing. My father is not alive. He passed away in 2006. Actually, he passed away the same month that the book was published, which was very hard. And I had been working on that book for a long time, 5 or 6 years actually, in different forms. And he had read versions of it, and he did read the final book, the published version, before he died. And he was sick, he was quite sick, right? And so we didn't have a chance to really go through all the details. Although if you read my book, if you read that book, you would know that my dad and I definitely would have fought about it. And so, because we would find things to fight about, even if there was nothing to fight about. So, you know, I'm sure that there would have been an element of you know, of course. And that leads me to this other question is, if you're writing about real people, there will always be a different perception from someone else about what you're writing. We're subjective creatures, and the things, our point of view is our point of view. For me, you know, and I think this is a generally accepted practice in memoir writing, you know, you want to tell your story, you can only stay in basically your point of view, but you don't want to hurt other people. And so walking a line between exposing certain things and not exposing certain things, I think, is important. I wrote Falling Through the Earth when I was pretty young, actually, and I was also living far away from my family. I was living in Eastern Europe when I wrote that book. So that distance and that bubble allowed me to write a very candid, perhaps too candid memoir, right? I think that if I was living in La Crosse and I was seeing them every day, I would never have been able to write that book. I guess, you know, it really depends on how much. But, and to answer the question of if it's cathartic, in many ways, I think it is. You know, when my father passed away, of course, I was, you know, really sad, but I had been spending time for years thinking about my relationship with him and sort of processing what that relationship meant to me and how we were together and what the problems were. So it wasn't, in some ways I had already let him go. I don't know if that makes sense, but I had already analyzed all of that. And so when he did die, it wasn't as hard for me, if that makes sense. And so it was cathartic.
Along similar lines, Susan asks, are memoirs strictly factual, or does fiction creep in or fill in anywhere? So can you maybe give everyone just a nice overview of where that line is between memoir and novel, or if you know of hybrids that exist? And kind of along those same lines, people are asking, how do you deal with fuzzy memories or family who remember it differently?
Yeah, so there is no such thing as a hybrid memoir novel. It's either a memoir or it's a novel, right? And memoirs have to be, the facts have to be real, right? If I wrote a memoir about my dad who was a tunnel rat in the Vietnam War and my dad was not a tunnel rat in the Vietnam War, that would be a novel. And so the basic structure of a memoir are events that the narrator, the writer, the real person, me, lived through and experienced. Where the fuzziness comes in and where memoir is really its own form, right? Memoir is not journalism. Memoir is not strict nonfiction in the way that, say, I don't know, a report is, or, a sort of catalog of things that happened. It's not that kind of nonfiction. It's classed under sort of an umbrella of creative nonfiction, which means that people reading it know that it's the person writing, it's their personal story, it's their point of view, it's their subjective experience. And of course, there are fuzzy memories, right? None of us walk around with a camera strapped to our head or a tape recorder, like recording conversations. And yet in memoir, it's standard for there to be reconstructed dialogue, for example. So for example, in my memoirs, I have sometimes a whole page of characters talking with quotation marks in dialogue. Do I actually remember every word that was said? No, I don't. And it's assumed that I'm reconstructing from a sensation or a feeling or a mood about that conversation rather than actually having everything exactly the way that it was. It would be utterly impossible for anyone to do that. And also, it wouldn't be very fun to read if it was just, basically a transcription from a recording. So I think that in general, people understand that. Where it becomes hard is when, people do have differing memories of certain events. And to that problem, I think that if, for me anyway, and for other memoirists I know, if they feel that it's emotionally true to their experience and it's emotionally true to what they're trying to do in that book, they generally keep their version. That I think that if someone took a survey of 25 people and said, let's all have our own versions in this book, it would end up looking like a Picasso painting with all these different angles that no one can really have one perspective. So that's why, in some ways memoir is a difficult form. But it has to really be seen as one person's story. And, just like if you're sitting at a bar with someone and they're telling you a story, when you're listening to that story, that's that person's personal recollection. And you take it sometimes with a grain of salt.
We have another question for newer writers that want to put down oral history for younger family members. Do you have suggestions for how they can make the stories more interesting or relevant for future generations?
So I guess it's not for publication, it's really just for the family. Whoever wrote that, could you clarify? Or does it say it in the question? No. Okay, so I'll just answer for both, right? So if it's future generations, meaning like if it's a piece of literature and you're writing something that you want to stand on its own and remain part of literature for the future and not necessarily for family, then, obviously it has a lot to do with aesthetics, right? The writing, the vision of the writer, the quality of the storytelling. But if it's a personal, and I think that this is probably what it is, like a personal record that you're making, a personal record that you're making for future generations, there's all sorts of cool things you can do. One thing is, make something with pictures, right? Make a PDF with pictures and have family stories that correspond. or, you know, even something that I know that certain people do is they'll go around and take pictures specifically for their book or their, I don't know, their document. I don't even know how to classify that, because it's not quite a memoir, it's not quite a novel. It isn't a novel at all. It's just a sort of cataloging of family stories. And I find when I see those that they're quite interesting. This book that I showed you, where is it? So this was written, this is about my, you know, this guy's grandfather. And it's written by a historian, right? And it's just really historical documents after, you know, one after the next about the crazy stuff that this guy did. Like, you know, basically swindling people and going to West Point and signing up for the army and then taking off and going to New York and like stealing stuff there. Like he was really a character. And there's no pictures in that. That's really just a historical document. But I think that if you're making something for your family, there's all sorts of things you could do. You could include a genealogical tree in the way that, you know, that I showed you with the sort of chart that I made, photographs, family memorabilia, all sorts of things. And, you know, the cool thing now is that you can actually get these self-published, right? So, and it's relatively inexpensive to self-publish that kind of book. And it's something that will be around then for future generations, and a really good record.
Okay, someone else is asking, were there memoirs or fiction novels that were models for you while writing? Do you have recommendations?
Oh, that's such a good question. So for the memoirs, I really love the memoirs of Mary Karr. She has a number of them. I think she essentially only writes memoir. And she has a sort of iconic memoir called The Liars Club, about her childhood in Texas. But she's written a number of memoirs. Another one is Lit, about how she stopped drinking. And, you know, really interesting memoir as well. There's another memoir that came out a long time ago that not so many people read anymore, but I really loved when I was writing Falling Through the Earth. And it's called Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. Do you remember that? Does anyone remember that? It's by someone named Alexandra Fuller. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful book. It's also a family memoir, about essentially about her relationship with her parents. And it has a sort of similar vibe to The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. I don't know if you know that one, where the opening scene is one that I'll never forget, of, you know, the author riding down Fifth Avenue in a limousine on her way to a very fancy event. And she looks out the window and sees her parents dumpster diving for food, right? And then it goes back in time where she describes this really nomadic, you know, unstable childhood with her parents who just never wanted to have a home, were always moving around, had a very particular way of living in the world. And I think what ties all of those books together for me is the kind of compassion and the kind of love with which the authors write about somewhat difficult childhoods, right? One thing that Jeanette Walls has always said in interviews is that, you know, she loves her parents, right? There's a scene in that book where she's, I think, 4 or 5, and she's trying to cook her dinner, and she sets herself on fire, right? So it's not like there were no consequences to growing up with parents like that, and yet the memoir is filled with love and compassion and understanding, and I think that in order to write effectively about characters that are maybe difficult or interesting or different, is to find a way to see them with that kind of love. You know, something that I had, you know, that I really worked on with my memoir about my father was to find that place where he and I had this bond, and write from that point of view. So those are a few.
Also along kind of model or research lines, a couple questions on what resources have you found most helpful for ancestry research?
So I don't have a lot of really special resources. You know, I did go on Ancestry.com. I asked one of my aunts about this, right? She's the one that recommended that on my mom's side of the family. And my Aunt Christine has done a ton of research into that side of the family. So I've drawn more on speaking, you know, from oral histories, I guess, you know, more along the lines of me just calling up a family member and talking about a family, you know, our family. I feel really lucky actually that in my family, there is a kind of strong sense of wanting to keep the past known and alive, you know. So for example, the Italian side of the family, there's a group of, you know, I think a couple hundred people who have been, you know, that are distantly related to each other, but have been to Campodelcino, this village, and they try to go every year, right? Not the whole group at once, but some of them every year. And they go back and have made connections with people in that village and experience Italian life. Some of them have learned Italian. I even have an Italian passport, right? And some of them do too, because if you can trace your ancestry back to a family member, you know, in my case, it's my great grandfather, they will offer you an Italian passport. So I applied for that and got one, which makes me, I guess, a dual citizen. And so those connections are really interesting, you know, obviously for personal reasons, but as an artist and as someone who writes, it's gold, right? To be able to go back and talk to people who are obsessive about your family, who know every detail, who can say, you have to read this book because it's all about our great grandfather and all the crazy stuff he did, and you know, you should just check it out. So you know, I did a 23andMe test, as I told you. I used that for my research. I used Ancestry.com a little bit for my research. But essentially, other than, you know, finding the genealogical connections, all of my research is sort of boots on the ground going there. So, you know, as I said, with the Ancestor, I went to Italy and I went to the place where I wanted to set the novel. I walked around, I ate the food, I stayed in a castle, I stayed in another hotel. I talked to people about what life was like there. I found just little details that you wouldn't normally get from looking online or reading a book, like what kind of jobs people do in such a remote place, right? Like how do people pass the time? What kind of dogs are there, right? There's a dog in my novel that, you know, is like a guard dog, and I'm like, so what kind of dogs do people have here? Just these like kind of little things that seem insignificant, but when you're reading a novel or a memoir too, it's those details that that really stand out.
We had a couple questions asking about agents and editors and how did those relationships work? How much influence did they have over the story that you're telling?
So agents and editors are important, obviously. An agent, for those of you who don't know, a literary agent is someone who works with you before the book is sold to a publishing house. And the agent will often read drafts of the book, give feedback, tell you if they're, you know, if they're a good agent, you know, whether the book has a chance of selling or not. And then an editor is the person at the publishing house who actually buys the book. So a publishing house in general doesn't buy it, but it gets sent to a particular editor. And that editor has a budget each year that he or she can use to purchase books. And if that editor loves your book, they make an offer. And then, you know, some people think, oh, there it is, you're going to get it published. Well, no, actually. I mean, you are going to get it published, But often, for example, with the Ancestor, this is my 5th book. I spent a year editing with this editor. So we changed, she didn't like the ending. And after some discussion, I agreed. I didn't like the ending either. I totally rewrote the last 25% of the book multiple times. We edited and edited and edited. And I really think, for any writers out there who are, either published or going to get published or looking to get published, the idea that you write anything and it's not ever edited and you don't revise is really a myth. I think that the best writers rewrite many times, and they're sort of obsessed with getting just that right moment and just that right character, and they actually thank their editor for editing them. So, I know that there are some writers, and they're generally like, best-selling authors whose books are not really very literary, that don't get edited, and that's fine. That works for them. But for me, it's really important to have, to be pushed, right? I like to be pushed. I like the book to get better. And I find the criticism useful. Maybe because I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I don't know if any of you know what that is, but it's a writing workshop where you get a master's in fine arts in writing. And the structure of that workshop was every week, 10 people, maybe 12, would come into a room and we would read each other's stories and then we would criticize them. And I mean, sometimes the criticism could be brutal. And the point of that was not to demoralize and like have people go home and hang themselves, right? The point of that was to make the writer tough enough to withstand criticism and the real world editorial work that's going to happen if you're really a writer. It's hard. I can tell you, like, there were workshops where I would come out in the hall and see people crying, and it's hard, right? But I think that if you're really serious about your work, that's just part of it, and you get better, and it helps.
Well, thank you. That answered one of the other questions, was how do you feel that your MFA influenced you as a writer? And do you think you'd still be a writer for a profession with a different degree?
So I'll answer, because that's a little bit of a different question. So I'll answer that too, because I know a lot of writers who don't have MFAs. But what it did for me, especially because Iowa is very particular, right? It's a particular program. It's a very literary program. There are all kinds of different programs, but what it did for me is it gave me 2 years where I didn't have to do anything else but write. And that was the first time in my life that I didn't have, pressing financial worries. Because I got a scholarship, they paid me, they even gave me a stipend to pay for childcare because I had a baby when I went. And it was really like nurturing and kind of wonderful. On the one hand, the actual workshop itself was hard. And I learned a lot, and it was a growing experience, one that was not comfortable always. But so for me, what it did is it gave me that head start. It also, having an MFA opens the doorway to agents some ways. Like if you say, I went to this MFA program and I did this, they often will read your manuscript. Whereas if you don't have anything that shows you have experience, it's harder to get someone to read your manuscript. So that made a difference. But it's interesting now in the biography of my book, I don't think that MFA is even mentioned. Maybe it is, but no one cares later, right? It only matters, I think, in the very beginning and when you're forming your identity as a writer. I think that's most important then. And then, of course, if you want to teach, if you want to teach it, if you want to be a professor, often the universities will ask for a terminal degree, and an MFA is a terminal degree for writing. So in that respect, it's good.
Another more technical question for you. Someone's asking if you're writing I think they mean memoir, do you have to change character names for legal purposes?
Mm-hmm.
The character was really recognized.
Yeah, so actually, yes. If it's a minor character, or if it's a character that, that would object, right? And would sue you. Yes. And you also, I had legal teams go through both of my memoirs and say, okay, you need to change this detail. It's too specific, which is weird because it's the exact opposite of what you think you need to do to make a good piece of writing, is to have very specific details and very specific character traits. But they'll come in and say, nope, this profession has to change. You say this person is a doctor, let's make them, I don't know, a teacher. You know, you have to mask the identity to basically protect that person and protect yourself. So yeah.
All right, Danielle, we have one more question that I don't think we've got to yet. And it's, do you use a timeline while writing, such as historical events that parallel with characters and generations?
That's such an interesting question because in the beginning of my writing career, when I wrote Falling Through the Earth and Angelology, I didn't do that, right? I didn't even use an outline of any sort. Falling Through the Earth was a bit of a intuitive thing because I wrote many versions of that book before I found the right form, if that makes sense. Like for a long time, I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop as a fiction writer. So the first version of a book about me and my dad was a novel that was absolutely 100% different from the book that got published. And in fact, that book won an award. It won the Dana Award in the novel as a novel. But then an agent represented it and sent it out to, I think, 25 publishers, and nobody wanted to publish it. And so that book got put away. And so what was interesting is that some of the responses from these editors were, I just don't believe this. I just don't believe it. And actually a lot of it was true, right? A lot of it is stuff that, you know, my dad was a tunnel rat, and tunnel rats did have amazing stories, right? But it's harder in fiction sometimes to make incredible personal stories feel true. And then that sounds like a contradiction. But in order to make events in novels seem real, there's a lot of architecture around it, and I'm getting really technical here, that allows you to make something feel real. But that's another story. And so I put it away and I was depressed for a little while, like, oh man, I just spent all this time writing a novel. And then a friend of mine who had gone to Iowa, this writer named Tony Swafford, published a book called Jarhead. I don't know if you remember that, like that was in like 2003 or something. And when we were at Iowa together, he had been writing fiction about that topic. And I thought, and he pivoted and he wrote a memoir, and it did very well. And I thought, well, you know, I could just write a memoir instead. And so I wrote a memoir, and it sold right away. I put it in a different form. So I think I don't remember the question. Am I answering the question? Can you remind me what it was so I can just make sure I finish?
How do you use a timeline?
Okay.
Parallel historical
So,
events with characters.
Right. So because I was working in that way, which was very intuitive, I wasn't really doing the kind of workman-like planning that a working novelist who writes a book a year, or a working writer who is really like set on producing does. So I didn't have all those systems in place. I didn't use an outline. I didn't have a timeline. I didn't have like all the research cataloged in a certain way. I just had everything everywhere, sticky notes on the walls, and like, you know, it was a mess. Now that I'm working on my 6th book, I've got more of a system in place, and I do make a kind of you know, a kind of timeline of events. I also do something that in the screenwriting world they call a beat sheet, which if I have it, I can show you. I don't know if I do though. I don't want to go through all my files, but it's essentially an Excel spreadsheet where you go through every action, not chapters, not events, but every action that the character makes. So it can be something small, from like she wakes up and makes herself coffee, to something large, like she gets shot. And you have those actions, and I have them all cataloged as I'm going, so that when you're editing, it makes it easier. And also I have another line on that spreadsheet that allows me to drop in details that I want to go in those scenes. So for example, like the details in the Ancestor about, let's just say, the cheese that I had for breakfast, like, oh, I want to include that somewhere in my book. I will drop that photograph actually in the spreadsheet and have it. And that way I keep everything sort of in one place, and it's much more organized. One thing that I learned, from being sort of more intuitive and moving into a sort of more structured way of writing is that it just makes editing easier. It makes promotion easier, because if you're doing a book event like I am today, I can pull out things like those photographs. I can pull out the genealogies that we did beforehand. I can pull out the family crest that we made, and I can use that to talk about what I did. Whereas whereas with my first novel, like Angelology, I wrote it all on scraps and like threw it all away. Like I don't have any of that stuff anymore. So yeah, so I've changed.
That's great. Thank you, Danielle. That covers all of the questions that we received. Do you want to take us home with one more piece of advice? Maybe address just the very last question that came in is, how should we start?
That's a great question to end with, right? I would start by finding a character, right? The best stories are, for me, about character and about a particular character, one that's interesting. And if you're using, a family story, maybe find the most dramatic, interesting character in your family and start there. I just listened to a talk with, has anyone seen The Queen's Gambit on Netflix? So yeah, I love it. I know I worked in the same writing space with the author, with the writer of that series, the writer director of that series. And he just had a talk about his process of writing. And he was talking about how it all begins with a character and being able to hear the character. So what you might want to do is think about the character you're most interested in and just start exploring. Like, what is that? Where is that character from? What time period? What kind of things would that character do? What kind of stories would emerge from that character? And, I think that's writing from, letting it radiate out from that person is, I think, the best way to get a hold of the material, because the hardest part, right, to start is like, there's just so much to say, so much material. Where do we go? How do we get involved? But I would just start with the most intriguing and interesting person.
Great idea. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us. We wish it was in person, but we are so grateful to have you for our virtual writing series.
Well, thank you. It was really a pleasure. And if anyone wants to stay in touch, find me on my website, or you can send me a question through my website, or find me on Twitter or Facebook, and I'm always on. As Jess knows, I'm always on there writing silly stuff. So come and find me and stay in touch. And thanks for being here.